I didn't raise my voice when the HOA president said I was trespassing. I didn't interrupt her either. I stood there with my hands resting on the top rail of the gate they'd welded shut that morning, watching her pace back and forth on the gravel like she was trying to build momentum through volume alone. She kept pointing past me, toward the narrow road that disappeared into the trees behind my cabin, insisting that I had no authority to block community access and that I was creating a safety hazard by refusing to reopen the gate. I let her finish. When she finally ran out of air, I reached into the bed of my truck, pulled out a folded survey map and a stamped deed copy, and laid them across the hood where she could see the boundary lines clearly marked in red. I didn't explain. Them. I didn't have to. Her lawyer, who had been standing off to the side scrolling on his phone, stepped closer, leaned in, and went very still. That was the moment I knew the argument had already ended, even though she hadn't caught up to it yet. Before that morning, before the locks and the threats and the sudden interest in land that had been ignored for decades, my life had been quiet in a way that feels almost suspicious to people who don't live it. I didn't move to the cabin because I wanted isolation in some dramatic sense. I moved there because I wanted continuity. The land had been in my family long enough that its boundaries felt less like lines on paper and more like habits. The road curved where it always had. The creek flooded where it always had. The trees leaned the way they leaned because the wind came from the same direction every winter. I wasn't trying to escape anything. I was trying to stay somewhere that didn't ask me to keep proving I belonged. The cabin itself wasn't impressive. It wasn't supposed to be. It had started as a hunting structure decades earlier, expanded slowly as needs changed, reinforced where weather demanded it. The porch faced east because that's where the light came first. In the mornings, I'd sit out there with a mug of coffee and watch fog lift off the low ground in sheets, like the land exhaling. I fixed things as they broke. I split wood before winter because that's what you do when heat doesn't come from a switch. I kept the gate at the road more out of habit than security. It had never been locked before the HOA came along. There had never been a reason. My days followed a rhythm that didn't leave much room for conflict. I checked the fence lines once a week. I kept an eye on runoff after storms. I maintained the gravel on the access road myself because I preferred knowing exactly what condition it was in. Neighbors passed through occasionally, mostly longtime locals who'd been using that road before anyone thought to call it private or public. We waved. We talked when there was something worth saying. That was it. No meetings, no boards, no votes about what color a door should be. The subdivision beyond the tree line came later. At first, it was just survey stakes and machinery noise that drifted in on certain days. Then paved streets appeared, followed by uniform mailboxes, stone, entry signs, and the kind of landscaping that looks expensive but struggles to survive its first winter. I paid attention in the way you pay attention to something that isn't yours but might eventually affect you. I didn't attend any meetings because I wasn't invited, and even if I had been, I wouldn't have gone. My land wasn't part of it. The paperwork on that had been settled long before anyone thought to form an association. For years, the two worlds existed side by side without touching. They had their cul-de-sacs and their rules. I had my road and my gate. People assumed it had always been that way. That assumption turned out to be important later. I liked the quiet. I liked knowing that when something changed on my land, it was because I'd changed it, not because a committee decided it was time. I didn't put up signs, I didn't patrol boundaries, I didn't feel the need to remind anyone where my property began. Ownership, when it's uncontested, doesn't require performance. That was the version of my life the HOA never bothered to learn before they decided to interfere with it. The first sign that something had shifted came in a way that felt almost lazy. A laminated notice was zip-tied to the gate one morning, flapping slightly in the breeze like it hadn't been placed there with much thought. It cited an unauthorized obstruction of community access and referenced an HOA bylaw number by. didn't recognize. There was a compliance deadline, a fine amount, and a phone number at the bottom. No greeting, no explanation. Just an assumption printed in bold that the road behind my gate belonged to them. I stood there longer than I needed to, reading it over and over, not because it was confusing, but because it was so confidently incorrect. That road had existed. Before the subdivision, before the association, before the word community had been repurposed to mean managed. It cut through my land because it had always cut through my land. There was nothing ambiguous about it. I took the notice down, folded it, and put it on the kitchen counter like something I'd deal with later. Later came faster than I expected. Within a week, a second notice appeared, this one citing safety concerns. It claimed emergency vehicles, required unobstructed access through the gate, and that my refusal to comply could expose the HOA to liability. That phrasing caught my attention. Liability has a way of revealing how someone thinks the law works, not how it actually does. I noticed, too, that neither notice referenced an easement, a recorded right-of-way, or any county documentation. They spoke as if repetition itself created authority. At that point, I still believed it was a misunderstanding. Someone new on the board. Someone reading a map without knowing its age. I called the number on the notice and left a voicemail explaining, calmly, that the road and gate were on private land, not subject to HOA rules, and that there had never been a public access designation. I referenced the deed by number, offered to send copies, and assumed that would be the end of it. It wasn't. The voicemail was never returned. Instead, an email arrived 2 days later from the HOA president herself. It thanked me for raising concerns and informed me that the board had reviewed the situation and determined the road was essential infrastructure for the neighborhood. It instructed me to remove the gate immediately or face escalating fines. There was no acknowledgement of the deed I'd mentioned. No questions. Just a conclusion. That was the moment confusion started giving way to something colder. I replied politely, attaching a scanned copy of the deed and the original survey, both clearly showing the road entirely within my property boundary. I explained that while I understood their concern for emergency access, no such access had ever been granted, and that county records would confirm this. I suggested a meeting to clear things up before it went any further. The response came back shorter this time. It told me the board did not recognize my interpretation of the documents and advised me to work cooperatively to avoid enforcement action. Work cooperatively, in their language, meant comply. Over the next few weeks, the pressure increased, in small, deliberate steps. A final notice appeared, taped more carefully to the gate this time. A neighbor stopped by to mention he'd heard the road was supposed to be communal and that I was causing problems. Another asked whether I was worried about getting sued. The narrative was already moving without me, shaped by people who had never walked the land or opened the records. I sent one more email, firmer than the last. I cited the county parcel map, the absence of any recorded easement, and the state statute governing private access roads. I made it clear I wasn't trying to be difficult, only accurate. I asked again for a meeting, this time offering specific dates and times. They declined. Instead, the HOA began issuing fines. Paper notices arrived in envelopes now, formal and official-looking, each one escalating the amount. They referenced board authority, community standards, and compliance timelines that had no relevance to me whatsoever. I didn't pay them. I didn't argue each one. I kept them, stacked neatly in a folder, because by then I'd stopped thinking about persuasion and started thinking about pattern. That was the emotional shift. Not anger, not fear. Focus. I realized they weren't interested in understanding where their authority ended. They were testing how much resistance it would take before I gave in. And once that clicked, the approach changed. I stopped calling. I stopped explaining. I stopped assuming good faith. That's when I started pulling records. I didn't make a show of it when I started digging. From the outside, nothing about my routine changed. I still walked the property in the mornings. I still kept the gate locked the way it had always been locked. If anyone had been watching closely, they might have noticed the lights on later at night, or the way I stopped throwing envelopes away. But otherwise, it would have looked like I was just another stubborn landowner refusing to budge. Inside, everything had shifted. The deed came out first. Not the copy I kept for convenience, but the original packet my father had insisted I store in the fireproof safe when I inherited the place. Thick paper, heavy ink, survey descriptions written in a style you don't see anymore, when boundaries were described with landmarks instead of marketing language. I laid it out on the table and read it slowly, line by line, the way you read something when you're no longer looking for reassurance, just confirmation. Then I pulled the survey that was attached to it. The original one, not the HOA's glossy subdivision map with its softened lines and unlabeled assumptions. This one had coordinates, bearings, elevations. The road was clearly marked, so was the gate. No easement, no shared access, no ambiguity. It was almost boring in how definitive it was. That was when I started asking myself why they were so confident. Confidence without documentation usually means one of two things: ignorance or precedent. Either they genuinely didn't know, or someone before me had let them get away with it. I needed to know which one, because the response to each is different. I went to the county records office the next morning. There's a particular smell to those places: paper, dust, time, and a particular rhythm to how information moves through them. You don't demand, you ask, you wait, you let clerks talk. I requested everything tied to my parcel number that referenced access, transportation, or right-of-way. Then I asked for anything related to the subdivision across the boundary, especially early filings from when the HOA was formed. It took a while. Some of it was digitized. A lot of it wasn't. Over the next few days, I made multiple trips back. Each time, the stack of copied documents grew thicker. Old zoning approvals, planning commission notes, environmental impact assessments. And then, buried in a folder that looked like it hadn't been opened in years, I found what I was looking for. The road. Not the way the HOA described it, but the way the county did. It was listed as a private maintenance access route associated with the original parcel, mine, with no public designation and no recorded easement granted to adjacent properties. There was even a note, handwritten in the margin, referencing a rejected proposal decades earlier to formalize shared access, denied due to liability concerns. They hadn't just assumed, they had tried once before, and they had been told no. That explained the confidence. They weren't ignorant. They were counting on time. From there, everything became procedural. I requested certified copies of the relevant records. I photographed the gate, the signage, the placement of the notices. I saved every email. I logged dates, times, and language. Not because I expected a dramatic confrontation, but because systems respond to completeness. Emotion gets ignored. Documentation doesn't. At home, the atmosphere changed in subtle ways. My partner didn't ask as many questions anymore. She didn't need to. She could see the binders forming, the tabs appearing, the way my focus narrowed. We talked less about what the HOA might do and more about contingencies, liens, access, interference, legal notices. I explained what they could try, and more importantly, what they couldn't. Still, the tension lingered. Understanding the law doesn't make pressure disappear. It just gives it shape. Neighbors grew quieter, too. The road became a topic people avoided unless they were already committed to an opinion. A few stopped making eye contact altogether. One mentioned casually that the HOA president was saying I was holding the neighborhood hostage. That phrasing didn't bother me the way it probably should have. It was useful. It told me how she planned to justify what came next, and something always comes next. The escalation arrived in the form of a contractor's truck. I came back one afternoon to find orange cones placed just inside my boundary, right before the gate. No notice, no letter, just a man with a clipboard measuring the road width like it was already a settled matter. I asked him who authorized the work. He gave me the HOA name without hesitation. I told him he was standing on private land. He shrugged and said he had a work order. That was the moment I knew this was no longer about paperwork drifting into misunderstanding. They were moving forward as if the decision had already been made, as if reality would eventually rearrange itself to match their expectation. I didn't argue with him. I took photos. I noted the company name. I asked him to leave. He said he couldn't without instruction from the HOA. I told him he was trespassing and that he should expect a call from his supervisor. Then I walked back to the house and added a new section to the binder. That night, I didn't sleep much. Not because I was worried exactly, but because the final shape of things had become clear. They weren't going to stop on their own. They were going to force a confrontation, and they were going to do it publicly. That meant timing mattered. It meant the reveal couldn't be reactive. It had to be placed. I finished organizing everything just before dawn. Deeds, surveys, county, records, photographs, correspondence, each piece where it belonged. When I closed the binder, it felt heavier than paper should feel. That was when I knew I was ready. The meeting notice arrived 2 days later, slid into my mailbox like it was doing me a favor. Emergency board session. Access violations. Security. Concerns. Mandatory attendance requested. The wording tried to sound procedural, but it was sharpened with accusation. They wanted witnesses. They wanted pressure. They wanted me on the defensive. I didn't respond. Instead, I confirmed something I already knew. I called the county planning office and asked a very specific question about emergency access routes for the subdivision. Not hypotheticals. Not opinions. I asked which recorded road was listed as their primary and secondary exit for fire and medical response. The woman on the other end put me on hold for a moment longer than usual, then came back with a tone that had shifted just enough to matter. "There's only one," she said. "And it crosses parcel 17B, I replied. "Yes," she said after a pause. "That's correct. Parcel 17B was my land." That was the last piece. The meeting was held in the HOA clubhouse, the kind of place designed to feel authoritative without actually having authority. Neutral paint, framed mission statements, a long table that made people feel smaller the farther they sat from the center. I arrived early, not because I wanted control of the room, but because I didn't want to rush. I placed the binder in front of me and waited. They arrived together. Board members first, stiff and rehearsed. Then the HOA president, last as expected, carrying herself like someone who assumed the outcome was already written. She didn't look at the binder. She didn't look at me for more than a second. She didn't need to. In her version of things, the gate was already sealed, the road already theirs, and I was already the problem. She started talking before anyone officially opened the meeting. She used words like obstruction, liability, community safety. She said I was denying access to emergency services. She said residents felt threatened. She said the HOA had no choice but to act. She didn't raise her voice, but she sharpened it, the way people do when they think volume isn't necessary. When she finally paused, someone looked at me and asked if I had anything to say. I didn't stand. I slid the binder forward and opened it. I started the way people never expect you to start, with maps. County-certified plats, not HOA diagrams. I showed the road, I showed the boundary, I showed the absence of any easement. I let the silence do most of the work. Silence makes people lean in. It makes them uncomfortable. It makes them listen. Then, I turned to the emergency access designation. I explained calmly that the subdivision's only recorded ingress and egress route crossed my land. I explained that sealing my gate without permission didn't just block me, it boxed them in. I didn't accuse, I didn't threaten. I just explained how it worked, the same way you'd explain gravity to someone who'd been insisting otherwise. The HOA president interrupted me. She said the road had been treated as shared for years. She said precedent mattered. She said the community depended on it. She said the HOA had authority to secure access in emergencies. That was when I placed the final document on the table, the county denial letter, dated decades earlier, addressed to the original developer, explicitly rejecting shared access due to liability exposure and landowner objection. Signed. Recorded. Ignored for a very long time. The room changed. It wasn't dramatic. No gasps, no shouting. Just the subtle shift of people realizing the ground beneath the argument had disappeared. One board member leaned back in his chair and folded his arms. Another stared at the table. The president stopped talking mid-thought, like her mouth had outpaced reality. Someone asked what this meant. I told them exactly what it meant. It meant the gate they sealed was on private land. It meant the road they relied on was never theirs. It meant every notice, every threat, every action taken without permission was now documented interference. And it meant that if emergency services were delayed because of their decision, the liability wouldn't stop with me. That word landed hard. Liability has weight. It doesn't care about tone or intention. It doesn't care how confident you were. When you made the call, the HOA's attorney finally spoke. His voice was careful. He asked if there was a way to resolve the matter cooperatively. I told him there was. Step 1 was unsealing the gate immediately. Step 2 was a written acknowledgement of the road's status. Step 3 was never doing this again. No drama, no punishment, just correction. They agreed faster than I expected. The gate was unsealed the next morning, not ceremoniously, not with an apology. Just quietly, like it had never been touched. The cones disappeared. The notices stopped. The emails slowed, then stopped entirely. The HOA president didn't resign right away, but her authority did. You could feel it in the way people spoke around her after that. Careful, distant. Neighbors started waving again. Some avoided the topic entirely. Others apologized without really apologizing. The way people do when they're relieved they don't have to choose sides anymore. Emergency vehicles drove the road once that week, slow and deliberate, as if testing something that had been assumed for too long. At home, the air felt lighter. Didn't celebrate. I didn't need to. The binder went back on the shelf. The gate stayed locked the way it always had, not out of spite, but out of clarity. The road remained what it had always been, mine to maintain, mine to grant access, to mine to protect. A month later, the HOA president stepped down. No announcement, no explanation, just absence. The new board sent a letter acknowledging the boundary and thanking me for my cooperation. I didn't respond. Cooperation implies shared authority. This had never been shared. Life settled back into its old rhythm. Quiet mornings, long walks, the sound of wind through trees instead of meetings through walls. The kind of quiet that doesn't happen by accident. Looking back, I understand why they thought they could do it. Most people don't read deeds. Most people assume access means ownership. Most people confuse time with permission. They sealed my gate because they thought it was symbolic. They didn't realize it was structural. And when they learned the difference, I didn't feel vindicated. I felt peaceful. Because nothing had changed except that the truth was finally acknowledged. And that was always enough.